Hello, everyone. Welcome to Due Process. This is Trevor Wadden. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Joe Eastwood about investigative interviewing. Joe received his PhD in experimental social psychology in 2011. He is now a professor of psychology at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. His research interests center on improving policing procedures through psychological science. He has a particular focus on investigative interviewing, alibis, comprehension of legal rights, and wrongful convictions. Joe works closely with police and government and is the director of the Applied Law Enforcement Research and Training Lab, a lab that aims to improve law enforcement practices through psychological science. Joe, it's great to have you and thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So, Joe, there is a lot I wanted to cover with you today, so I figure we'll just jump right into it. And I want to start with the idea or the topic of forensic psychology. I think a lot of people intuitively will have some understanding of what psychology entails in terms of an academic discipline. But could you just kind of differentiate the two areas, forensic psychology from traditional psychology, for us?
Sure, yeah. So, psychology, obviously, that's the science of the mind, how people think and behave at the individual level. And really, all forensic psychology does is takes that approach, that mindset, and applies it to the legal system. And so you have people that are working in, memory, for example, but they do eyewitness testimony. So you're just taking it's very applied psychology, as you're taking the findings, you're taking the research questions, and you're saying, how does this apply to the legal system? How can we use psychology to improve all these different aspects of the legal system? That ranges all the way from treatment of sexual offenders to criminal investigations to eyewitness testimony, deception detection, people who are actually treating individuals. Those are studying from the outside. So it's pretty broad, but that's the basic idea, is that we take psychology and just apply it to the legal system.
And these research areas that I mentioned in the introduction, can you tell us a bit about why you became interested in those? Is that something you've always had an interest in, or is it something you discovered through your academic career?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in psychology, in, as many people are, human behavior, why people do the things they do. But how I got into this route actually is I met during my undergraduate degree, met a professor named Brent Snook, who was in the forensic area looking for people to join his research group. And I didn't know what forensic psychology was or what they studied or anything about it. But through meeting him, really became interested in the area, and then eventually ended up doing my master's and PhD with him on the area of interviewing, police interrogations, interviewing, questioning more broadly. So it wasn't on purpose, as it were, but once I learned more about the area, I became really, really interested in the forensic area. I think primarily for me, it's the applied nature of it. I've always really enjoyed the who cares. So how can we, I want to do research and learn things, but I've always been interested in the application of it. How can we actually change things, fix things? How does it work in the real world? How can we improve it? That's kind of where my mindset was. So that's what attracted me to a forensic area as well.
Right. So actually applying it to real life. And something we'll talk about a little bit later is your involvement and working with law enforcement and helping them apply some of these principles that you've researched. But we'll start with just a general conversation about investigative interviewing and namely the importance investigative interviewing plays in police investigations. Can you just give us, I know it seems like a common sense and maybe a straightforward question here, but can you give us an idea of why investigative interviews are so fundamental and important to an appropriate police investigation?
Sure, yeah. So typically, from a policing perspective, they typically break it down by sort of victim witness interviews and then the suspect interview. And there's sometimes overlap between those things, but there's a couple major reasons that I've seen why they're so important. So in many cases, I know there's been, with the rise of forensic science and a lot of the shows on it and so on, there's this perception that everything comes down to the fibers of the blood analysis and so on. And obviously that's can be important, but in many cases, the only people who are fully aware of what happened are those that were involved, particularly in a historical type situation. And so talking to the people, first of all, who it happened to or it happened in front of, they're often going to be either the sole or the primary source of information about what happened. So if you can't get a clean account from them, it's very difficult to understand what exactly happened. And on the other side of things, even if you do have some physical evidence and so on, oftentimes you don't have a sense of context about why it happened that way or why this certain evidence was found in this way. So, you might find fingerprints, for example. Okay, fair enough. But if there's a relationship between the two people, unless you know the context of when they got there or so on, was there consent in the sexual type situation? you need to talk to people to get that information and get a proper account of what happened. And then on the suspect side, a again, they're often the sole source of what actually happened. If they're the ones who committed this crime. And two, in order to we'll talk about this perhaps later, but in order to do a effective interview with the suspect side of things, the person you think may have done it, it's very important to have the information from the people that either happened in front of or to or so on to use within that interview to compare the suspect's account against, to decide if what they're saying matched up. So the whole process is so heavily dependent on talking to people, getting clean accounts from them, detailed accounts, and then building that whole structure of the investigation to fully understand what actually happened. And without doing that properly, you're just going to have a lot of a lot of holes in the situation, or unexplained things, or things that don't match up. So it is so fundamental to almost every investigation, talking to people and getting good clean accounts from them.
And obviously getting the clean accounts and the accurate information is fundamental. And I think there might be some out there who maybe have never tried to interview or sit down. Obviously, not a lot of people, if you're not involved in law enforcement, you wouldn't have an opportunity to do an investigative interview. But I think there might be a bit of a misconception, or this idea that interviewing is this straightforward process where you can sit down and you're just having a conversation with somebody to get information out of them. But having a little bit of experience with investigative interviews, and certainly even doing the interviews for this podcast, it's interviewing is a skill for sure, and it's something that has to be worked at, and it's not as straightforward as some may think. So why is it very important to conduct interviews appropriately based on evidence-based practices?
Yeah, and I would just that's something we always start with. A training that I do is again that assumption that anyone can conduct an interview, and that's true. Anyone can conduct an interview, but it is a highly complex skill that takes years of practice and using the right principles and building on that, because it is a complex social interaction with someone who's been through something very difficult often. So the idea that, well, you just learn on the fly, just jump in, ask some questions, sort it out, that's not going to work very well. Memory is very complex. It's very easily influenced. If not questioned properly, you're run a high risk of influencing the person with misinformation or leading questions. If you're not using memory enhancing techniques, for example, you're probably not going to get near as much as you could have from the person if you're not using the right questioning strategy. And then obviously on the suspect side, you're on a whole bunch of issues ranging from getting a statement they can't use because it was coercive or won't be admissible, to the person just not talking to you because you haven't, again, used strategies that are effective in creating conversation and dialogue with the person. So I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions about interviewing, is that it seems simple. You're just talking to someone, asking some questions, but to do it well over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 hours and systematically move through that is a very, very complex skill that takes a long time to develop well, and requires both knowing the right principles, applying them, getting feedback on it, and continually sort of learning that. So in terms of a stake, obviously, given the importance within the interview, within the investigation, if they're not done well, it's very hard to do a good investigation, thorough investigation, if the interviews aren't done well, because you're not getting the information, you're contaminating the information. It's just things aren't going to go as well as they should.
Right. And you suggested that there's obviously, especially for the suspect, if the interview isn't conducted appropriately, there's a chance a court, for example, may not admit that testimony or that interview. But in terms of the stakes, I mean, these are situations where in Canada's, for example, wrongful conviction history, some interviewing has been put under the microscope. So there are quite a bit high stakes in these situations. Turning now just to investigative interviewing in Canada in general, is there one particular methodology embraced in Canada or by Canadian police forces today that you're aware of?
No, that it's a simple answer, and it's one of the issues. Whether it's good or bad is up to debate, I guess. But one of the issues within Canadian policing in particular, and you see the same things in the U.S. for sure, is that there's not a whole lot of consistency between provinces, between police organizations, where every organization is essentially free to do what they think's best for their organization. And so the methodology used, the amount of training that's received, the approach that's taken really depends on who's ever in that particular organization running it and whoever they're speaking to and using. And so, in general, traditionally it's been more of a, I would say the most popular approach would probably be a read-based approach. But even there, it's not necessarily the official read training people are getting. It could be just, internal training that's based on those principles. And then two, you don't even know how much training people are getting and whether they're using it the way they were trained to do so. And so it's really, we've done a couple surveys throughout the years, but it's really quite piecemeal, unlike, say, in the UK, where it's a much more of a, it's not perfect, but much more of a top-down approach where best practices are put in place at the top level, and then it's kind of just dispersed across all the different organizations. Here's the expectations. Whereas in Canada, it's very much, again, there's no structure and there's no mandate of what, aside from case law requiring what you can't do, there's no real overarching structure. I mean, the Rcmp has their model, but that's one of the difficult things, I guess, is you don't know from organization to organization what they're doing or not doing, and so you have to talk to each individual group to see what they're doing. But in general, I would say it's been a combination of not a whole lot of training. So methodology is just whatever they've seen or come up with, and what the training that has received traditionally has probably been more of a read-ish based approach, whether or not it's official read or not. That's probably what most people would have had.
And we'll talk about the read style of interviewing a little bit later, but just so listeners are aware, that is a form of non-behavioral assessment and accusatory interview. Is that a fair summary of it?
Yeah, it's we'll talk about it obviously later, but I think it's more the two-step process of behavioral assessment, and then depending on that assessment, moving into the very guilt presumptive approach.
Okay. And it certainly seems like it does differ from force to force. And as you said, that this piecemeal approach, do you think that is just because of they're taking bits and pieces from the social sciences and looking at what our courts are saying about some investigative techniques, or any real rhyme or reason for the approach in Canada?
I think it's more just this is where we arrive because of how, policing has been set up in the country. I'm not an expert in that, but again, it's kind of this, what I've seen anyway, is kind of this, you look to certain organizations, they talk to other organizations, hey, we're doing this. And there's this kind of informal sharing of information of best practices and so on. But there's no, unless there's a formal, and this takes a lot of time and resources and effort, obviously, is part of the reason why it hasn't happened. But unless there's that overarching agreement somehow, this is what we should be doing, it's left to individual groups to just, again, I've created a relationship here with a local police organization. It's worked great, but that hasn't changed anything through the rest of the province, obviously, because, and again, some of them are doing great things, but we just don't know. And because there's no formal apparatus in place, there's no really place for every police organization to look for and say, hey, here's where, there's obviously these individual police colleges and stuff, but ideally what I would like to see is a set of best practice guidelines that every police, doesn't have to agree on every point, but it would be ideal, I think, to have, and efforts have been made to do this, but just to have that at least basic framework for here's how you should approach interviewing.
Right. Well, that was going to be my next question my question was going to be whether police forces, if a case goes to trial, for example, that they would be required to say, this is the interview methodology that we used. But your idea about at least best practices, they can at least say, we followed the best practices for the most part. This is the document that we used, etc. So at least then courts and the public will know what their police forces are using and what principles they're using during these investigative interviews.
Yeah, I think that would be ideal. That'd be ideal. I mean, there's been a hesitation, I guess, rightfully in some cases, of revealing the approaches that are used and so on. But I do think there's a transparency aspect to it. There's a evidence-based best practices aspect to it, to just say, hey, here's what we're doing and here's why. And that can only help. This is the argument we make in our training too, is that this can only help you in the ultimate step, which is when you're in court and you have to defend all the things that you did. Knowing that you have an evidence base for what you did and why can only help. So.
Okay. And just to summarize, Joe, then, beyond ensuring that someone's charter rights are protected and beyond ensuring that it's not cruel and unusual, the type of questioning and investigative interviewing style, there's no real laws or policies in Canada that would prevent a police force from using certain techniques or strategies.
No, not really. I mean, the main one people look to would be the Oikle ruling in terms of use of persuasion, and the idea that police have the right to use legitimate persuasion to convince someone to talk. This is a suspect side, obviously, to talk to them. But for better or for worse, that's a pretty vague criteria. They give some guidance, but it always comes down to the case and the totality of circumstances and so on. So really, all there is here's some things you probably definitely can't do, but what you should do or have to do is fairly open. It's more, the basics, what you can't do, or you're going to get tossed out. But within the framework of everything else, the courts don't really explicitly say you can't do a whole lot.
Okay. And is it fair to say, Joe, that our courts they seek a balance when they're assessing police interviewing? They want to ensure that they don't cross that line, but they also recognize that police forces need to be allotted some creative freedom to conduct these interviews. So they want to protect people's charter rights, but they understand that there's an interest in society's ability to solve crime, and they want police forces to have some creative freedom. So whether that's deception or some trickery, they will assess that on a case by case basis.
Yeah, and I think, and going back to what's at stake, I think one of the things that often gets missed is the idea that if whether that's something gets tossed or the allowance of certain strategies, there is the victim to think of too, in terms of if you can get the suspect to, again, we're not talking about false confession, but own up to what actually happened, then that might mean the victim doesn't have to go testify, doesn't have to go in front of a defense lawyer, and maybe again, that's from a psychologist's perspective, not a legal expert, but I do think that's the idea, is that if you're going to allow police organizations to investigate these type of incidents, you have to give some ability to question people about what they did. If you simply have and there's other ways you could run the system, obviously, but if you're going to have a system where the police are responsible for uncovering information, then they have to have at least some tools to do that. And there's always going to be a shifting guideline what those tools are. But if you're going to require that they perform that role, they need to have at least some latitude to question people who perhaps don't want to be questioned. Because that's just an interest, again, of discovering stuff. If you're not allowing people to question them, how will you get that information? So there has to be some, again, we can argue what those rules are, but there does have to be that latitude to at least question people.
Right. And we could certainly have quite the discussion about the techniques and strategies that police forces will use across Canada, but that's a little bit beyond the scope for today's purposes. But I did want to touch on looking at the suspect interview anyway. Traditionally, the hope would be for the suspect to own up to the fact that, yes, he or she committed this crime. When that happens, Joe, can you just take us through a little bit how a court will assess an interview that ends in a confession?
Yeah, so I think that the traditional, we'll talk about Reed versus Peace, but I think one of the differences perhaps with the newer type of interviewing is that the focus is more on information versus a confession. Now, if the person is guilty and actually did it, then obviously information, somewhat equals admissions or a confession. But I think that's one of the shifts. We can talk about that in a bit, but shifts between traditional and this. But yeah, so obviously if there is an admission and the person owns up to what they did, if of course they did in fact were responsible, the key, I think the key thing that the court's going to look at, again, I'm not a lawyer, but would be really the voluntariness of the situation. So did that person, when they said yes I did it, or yes I admit to this or that, were they doing so voluntarily? So there wasn't any type of too much oppression. They weren't allowed to go to the bathroom for 10 hours, or they whatever. They had their charter right to respect in terms of a lawyer. They weren't operating mind issues about did they understand what they were saying and the consequences of doing so. And so it's really about the behavior of the police that led to that person owning up to it. So, I mean, obvious examples would be if, I'm going to punch you until you tell me what you did. Obviously, that would not be admitted, but there's other more softer things, like, again, denying bathroom breaks and so on. That's been used. And then, of course, threats and promises are the big one, too, about inducements and, hey, just own up to what you did. You probably won't get that much time in jail anyway. That's not okay under law. So basically, the person has to just have chosen freely that I'm going to, for whatever reason, admit to this, what I did. And there's certain behaviors police can use that are fine legally, and then there's some that are not okay. And the big ones obviously are oppression and threats and promises, which you can't use. Well, you can use, but you probably won't get it admitted.
Right. And of course, the court, as you mentioned, they look at voluntariness, but it seems to be a case by case analysis where their phrase that they like to use is maintaining the integrity of the justice system. So that's a big component of it. And like you said, those things those promises or deceptions. They have to look at those things under that microscope. The question now I'll ask you, Joe, is whether you can, because the social science, and we'll get into talking about this, but the social science seems to be moving away from this assessment of non-verbal cues to more information gathering. Do you ever envision a day in Canada where courts will start forbidding certain types of investigative interviewing styles?
I don't foresee it right now, given the pace at which, in my the pace at which changes happen, and for good reason. I think there, if there were going to be changes, I don't expect it to be wholesale. You can't use this approach. You can't use that approach. I think the where they may get more strict, if I had to predict, would be on things like the deception side of things. Whether that's, you don't see this too often, certainly in Canadian context, but lying about evidence. That's a pretty heavy thing to consider, which courts do when it comes to voluntariness. But technically, it's still not disallowed. It's just one of those things where it'd be a strong thing to consider. So I think if there's going to be changes, it'll be more in the direction to protect, again, the false confession side of things. And there's more evidence coming out about that in the last 10, 15 years. So things like lying with evidence, now it's pretty much discouraged in almost all the training I've seen. Certainly we do, but could it be outright you can't do that anymore? Perhaps I could see that happening. So the more extreme cases, but I think the things like persuasion and what you actually say to the person, it's frustrating as a psychologist because you want definitive answers, and the legal system, it's always, well, it depends, which is fair enough because again, every situation is different. But so I don't foresee a wholesale you can't do this on many things, but I can see a more strictness in terms of the stuff we A, know can definitely contribute to false confessions, and B, in my opinion, you don't need to do an effective interview. I don't think you ever need to lie to someone with evidence to do a good interview. If anything, it can backfire both in the moment and later in the process. So those more extreme stuff, I think, just like you saw physical abuse in the 30s, 40s, you don't see that anymore. It just doesn't really happen, at least in police interviews in Canada. I can see things like lying with evidence going that way too. But there will always, in my opinion, if you're going to do suspect interviews, there will always be a need for some version of persuasion in those contexts.
So like you said earlier, maybe just that the courts will continue to add to that here's what you shouldn't do list, or presumptively this will potentially make the statement inadmissible. But it is interesting to think about, you look back in time and the history of interviewing, and there's certain things that it does make you wonder in another 20 or 30 years, looking back on some of the techniques that we're using now, what might seem strange to people in the future. The next topic, Joe, is just to get into talking about training, police training in general. And I just wanted to touch on this, obviously, because of your experience and background in working with law enforcement through your alert lab, and also just I think you do some consulting as well. I just want to first give a brief caveat that this is a general discussion, obviously, and that it's not meant to disparage any police forces or police officers, and that I recognize that police forces in general are often under a lot of administrative and financial constraints, which may limit the opportunity to and availability of certain training. So I just want people to keep that in mind in this discussion. This is a general discussion, and we're not trying to be unfair in our comments here. But in general, Joe, based on your experiences in Ontario and through your consulting, do you believe that police officers are receiving enough training with respect to how to conduct suspect interviews or even witness and victim interviews?
It's a pretty clear no to me, and I don't think it's anything to do with a lack of desire to have it. I think it's almost solely a resource issue, and it's something that I have a good relationship with the Durham Regional Police Service, obviously, and they've been kind enough to allow me to consult with them and work together to make sure their training is evidence-based. But to get through an organization, that's just one example, to get through an organization to have their members fully trained, and as we talked about, in a skill like this, it's more than just a day seminar where you read some slides or something. I mean, this is a complex skill that you need both intensive training on and then practice and feedback and so on. That just takes an enormous amount of time and money and resources, because every day away from training is a day that member is not in their unit and needs to be replaced. But so just get man and women power free, and it's incredibly difficult. To my experience, and going back to my Newfoundland days, that has always been the biggest challenge, is that how do you get the time and resources available to fully train people on these. And there's always new people being hired and new people retiring. And so to keep up with that, there's just not. And so we've had people in our training that, been 20 years, 25 years in, and this is their first or one of their first interviewing courses. And that's unfortunate because that would have been, useful many years ago. And when we do the training and afterwards, I mean, the feedback has always been, I want more of this, and B, I wish I had this earlier. And we recognize that. And I think every organization, both the members and the top, recognize that. But how do you actually do that? And unless there's a concerted push in terms of resources put behind it, it just doesn't happen. And I've been working in this area long enough to respect that argument that, listen, the phone doesn't stop ringing. There's the calls don't stop coming in just because we want to train people in interviewing. Like, it's just hard to get people free, put aside the time and money to do this. But I'd like to see it more, obviously, just personally, because it's so important. And again, the feedback and the appreciation of knowing these skills is strong. But how do you actually get that buy-in from every level? And that starts right from the top in terms of money and time. So
Right. So your experiences with Durham Police Service then, Joe, how has that, like, how have you seen them buy into the program? Have they been given financial support, or is it something that their leadership just has put a lot of value in?
yeah, I would, I speak very highly of all those that I work with and that, facilitate this. So it's really been a partnership, I guess, between their training branch and individuals involved, Paul Mitten originally and now Colin Rose, who partner with me and deliver these courses, and we create the curriculum together and deliver the courses together, with the idea being we can have both the practitioner perspective, which is vital, and then we can also have the research perspective, say, hey, here's some concepts that we know from research and stuff that we can add into that. And so it's really been the buy-in from their side, basically, that brings me in, allows me to contribute and put together some curriculum and talk about memory and persuasion and all these topics. But again, that and continues to take a lot of resources and time on their side in terms of booking the space and time and organization and all those things. So it's been in my opinion, just my opinion, but it's been a real credit to them for their desire. They want evidence-based practices, absolutely. And so it's been buy-in from their side. Again, to get the amount of members and the amount of people on these courses to get through, it's still tough to get us all the people trained you'd like to get trained. But credit to them, in my opinion, for stepping up and saying, hey, we want this to be evidence-based. Bringing a academic like myself and that can contribute. And I think the feedback we've got has been quite positive.
No, I think that's excellent. So is it officers of every level and experience?
Yeah, so it's been, I mean, again, there's different ways of doing this. It's really come down to partly availability of time, because the courses we run are 5 subsequent days. So you have to have 5 free days that you're able to get free from whatever unit you're in. So we've had a mix of, we try to, obviously, if you can, target investigative units and coach officers and so on. But we've had a mix of 3 or 4 years in to 20 to 25 years in, depending on the course, and from a range of different units. And our particular course, we do 12 at a time. And that's just so we can do a lot of practical exercises and interviews. We bring in actors and they do scenarios. So we keep it small so that they can get the full experience. The downside, of course, you can only do 12 per week in that. But I think the quality is there. And again, even if we train those 12 and they hopefully, get those skills, then at least, and this is something we encourage them to do, bring it back to your unit, discuss with, people there, or perhaps someone else in the unit also has the training, and then it can hopefully spread organically a little bit too, even though it's not the formal training. So at least some best practices and things to avoid and not do. So yeah, it's been positive. It's been a great experience, but the frustration is always like, it's still just not enough people through that you would like to see, but such is life.
And Joe, the interviewing that you teach to local law enforcement, can you just tell us about this style?
Yeah, so it's we like it has its own name in terms of, because of internal name from Durham, for example. It's they have their own names for it, but it's really, I would call a peace-based approach. I haven't talked about that yet, but what I try to do is really, we look at the literature and just pull all the best practices from there. So for victim witness, talk a lot about how memory works, the cognitive interview, how to maximize the amount of information you can get from someone who's cooperative. Talk about, obviously, rapport building and making the person feel comfortable and explaining the procedure and so on. And on the suspect side, a lot of the same things, actually: proper planning, build a connection with the person, some use of called persuasion, but not avoiding all those things that we talk about in terms of lying about evidence and so on. So it's a piece-based approach with some of the specific things that might be relevant, for example, case law and things that are relevant directly to Ontario in this case. That would include, in Canada, obviously charter stuff, all that stuff included to kind of make it relevant to, in this case, the Durham context. But the real key of what we're trying to get to is use stuff that we know both from experience but also the science works. And that's what you should be using.
Okay. So, Joe, if I gave you a magic wand and money and resources weren't an issue, you could train every officer in at least a foundational course about how to do an investigative interview, suspect, witness, victim. What would you like to see police forces do in terms of maintaining those skills? And is there a minimum annual allotment of training that you think police forces should be incorporating in training their officers?
Sure, yeah. So in terms of ideal, and again, I say ideal in big letters, but the ideal I think would be that every officer early on in their career gets a strong fundamentals interviewing course that includes these best practices. And then, and this is based on it has been a ton of research on this because of difficulty to do, but what will be ideal is that particularly those in investigative units, but even those that aren't, whether it's 6 months or a year, either comes in for a mock interview for assessment or submits an interview that they've conducted. Because the real key that we've seen is, yes, you need that basis of training and you need that information, but until you can go out and apply it, work through it, get some feedback on that. Okay, you did this well, maybe work on this, do that again. And you need that repeated expert feedback and evaluation if you're going to keep that skill set up. And I mean, again, you talk about it as a complex skill. Well, same for any complex skill. You don't just, if you're in the NHL, you don't just walk on the ice for a game after a year of not doing anything. And you need feedback, you need practice, you need coaches. So that's what I think would be an ideal setup, where you get that foundation, you build on it, you practice feedback, and then perhaps have a higher level training for those. If you're going to be in the homicide unit, for example, or maybe SAU, and you need that specialized, or child interviewing, have those specialized courses as they move up. But as we say when we talk to the recruits, like, your job is, you talk to people every day, side of the road, car accident, doesn't matter. So knowing the basics, building on that as you move through your career with constant feedback would be the ideal. But if you have, 500 officers and they're each submitting a video twice a year, that's an hour long. You start doing the math on that and you realize why no police organization, certainly in Canada, has, in my knowledge, has figured out how to actually do that, because the amount of resources it would cost would be huge. The one thing I would say that I think could work is if you pair that with research. And this is where I try to contribute as well, is that all that information that you're gaining, training and feedback, is also a chance for research. So assessing, and so if you could pair that with the academic side and turn into research projects that are supported by grants and so on, there are, I think, unique ways you could get some of that resources available, but it requires a high level of cooperation between police organizations and different partnerships like myself. So it can be difficult to navigate, but that's what I think would be ideal, is that constant feedback loop that is necessary to keep the skills up.
So does Durham, is there practice to record or all of their interviews?
Certainly obviously all suspect interviews, absolutely, or accused interviews. I wouldn't say necessarily all, but certainly the vast majority of victim interviews. So, example, if someone comes in for a sexual assault, and is getting that initial statement on camera, that's going to be fully video recorded start to finish. So there might be some that aren't fully recorded, but certainly anything in the sit-down room is absolutely start to finish recorded, transcribed, and that's been the practice here for quite a while. Still not in the States, obviously, for a lot of places still, but yeah, absolutely here, and especially on the suspect side in terms of fully capturing everything that happened from start to finish.
So ideally, when an officer conducts one of these, let's just say a suspect interview, if it's recorded, they could maybe sit down with somebody once or twice a year even and have that reviewed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that happens informally a bit, but there's no, again, because suspect interview 2 hours, to watch it would be at least 3, if not 4 hours. Then schedule a feedback meeting, and then you start doing the exponential math out.
It's challenging for sure.
Yeah.
But we did talk about how this is a complex skill and how it is a perishable skill, meaning that if you're not doing it often, there's a chance that you're going to lose it over time.
Mm-hmm.
The training then that you offer Durham, is that something that they can continually come back and visit you guys for refreshers and courses?
As of right now, we've structured it so that we have a 1 day with the recruits when they're first hired just to give the very basics. But in terms of the full length courses, we currently have two, sort of the introductory course and the advanced course. So and in order to take the advanced, you have to take the introductory. So there is sort of somewhat of a tier based system. But once you have that first course and that second course, which again, that assumes you can get free from your unit and so on, it's difficult, obviously, but we've had several groups through. After that point, it's really, obviously it's difficult for me because I don't have internal access, so I can't. They just send me a bunch of videos and I'll watch them. But there is the option offered certainly by those the train, like right now his name's Colin, for those who want informal feedback to just send a video to him and he will give informal feedback. It's not like, again, it's not going to be part of any formal part of the record or anything, but there's not, once that training's over, there's no, as far as I'm aware, systematic feedback loop. I mean, you have your partner and you have people you can lean on internally, but there's not that. What I think would be ideal, this would never happen, but a group of, whether it's 3 or 4 or 5 really expert interviewers that's just all they do, is they either conduct interviews or provide feedback in interviews. As you can imagine, by the time you factor in time, salary, and so on, who's paying for that? But that, I think, is what would be ideal.
I want to turn now, Joe, to just discussing the different types of investigative interviews. And there are, of course, as I talked about, especially in Canada, a lot of different techniques and strategies and innumerable ways that someone could conduct. We'll keep it to suspect interviews for this part of it.
Sure.
So there's lots of different ways that someone could conduct one of these interviews, from the type of questioning or the environment that they're doing the interview in, to the length of the interview, etc. Some of the things we've already discussed. But from my research, Joe, and you can certainly jump in and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I found that there are essentially two dominant categories in which a lot of these interviews can be labeled. So you have, first, there's the interviews that are more accusatory, that kind of come in with suspicion or guilt kind of already being established, and they're looking at things like how the person is behaving, nonverbal cues, for example. And then you have the second style of interview where it's more specifically designed to collect and interpret information. And to give listeners an idea of these two different approaches, I do want to compare the Reed style of interview, which we've briefly mentioned, which is a form of accusatory interview, with that of the PEACE model, spelled PEACE.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a form of information gathering interview. And we'll start with examining the Reed interview. You've given us a bit of an idea of what it is, but can you just go in a little bit more in depth in explaining what Reed is and where it originated?
Sure, yeah. So it's originated in the U.S. I think it might have as early as the 40s when it started to be put together. But since that time, they're in their 5th edition of their actual textbook. They have training seminars all across the U.S. and Canada, and it's been sort of a go-to since the 60s, at least, in terms of the type of training. So in terms of the structure, obviously there's a lot to it, but to me there's two basic components. One is what they call sort of the interview portion, the pre-interrogation portion, whatever you want to call it, where it's more informal, you're just chatting with the person, and what you're trying to do is essentially determine, based on some of these preset questions that they provide and the answers that you're supposedly looking for, and their nonverbal behavior of the suspect, do you think this person did it? Based on their behavior, based on the evidence, and so on. So that's what you're trying to ascertain in the original, more informal, sort of just back and forth type interview. Then you sort of pause and make that decision. Is this person guilty or not? If they aren't, obviously that's the end essentially. But if you think they are guilty, then under the Reed style, that's when you enter what they call their 9-step approach, which is it's been called guilt presumptive, because the idea is that you've already made up your mind essentially based on your evidence that this person's guilty. So you have a 9-step approach to obtain a confession. And that starts with, direct positive confrontation. Look, there's no doubt in my mind you did this. What I'm here to do is get the why. We're already past the fact you didn't, Then you spin into these themes about, why you might have done it, minimize it, blame the victim and so on, these sort of psychological persuasion type stuff. And then et cetera, you work your way to the alternative question, which is some version of, hey, did you take the money because, you need to gamble or go to the casino, or is this because you're a hardworking guy and needs to pay for your kids to eat? So you kind of give them that good reason, bad reason type idea. either one they choose, obviously you assume they're going to choose the one that makes them look good, but they're still admitting to it. And then you build up that, oh, it's because of this reason, to get more of a full confession from them, and then turn that into traditionally into a written confession. Now it's all videotaped, so probably less important. But so the whole goal of it, once you make that switch from pre-interview or the interview process to the interrogation, the 9-step interrogation, it's really the goal is confession. That's success. That's the steps that it's either a confession or it's a failed interview, essentially, is what the thought is. So that's the basics. I mean, they have a textbook I've read a few times. It's been a couple of years, but that's the basic idea behind Reed, is the guilt presumptive. And then once you make that decision, it's really a step-by-step, or supposed to be a step-by-step process. Every interview is a little different, to move people from I didn't do it to I did do it, and here's how. That's the basic idea.
Okay. So the first phase of the interview, Joe, where they're trying to determine whether this person is innocent or guilty, what type of factors do they consider?
So obviously they have their pre-interview planning where there's, physical evidence and stuff, but in the room, really it's a combination of different assessments of nonverbal behavior. And in the book and their training, they have different pictures of, how the person's leaning, or defensive behaviors, or nonverbal indicators. And then they also have their various questions that they would ask that supposedly can evoke different types of responses, and based on the person's responses fall into likely being deceptive versus likely not. And so things like, I don't want to misquote the wording, but things like, what do you think should happen to someone who committed this type of crime? Or things like, and then, so again, I'm not saying this is just what is part of their approach, depending on whether they say, well, they should definitely be punished to the full extent, or, well, you know what, there's always reasons for why these things happen. You can categorize people into likely being deceptive, likely, innocent. So combining all those factors together, the interviewer is supposed to, after however long it takes, make a decision. Okay, I'm convinced this person is guilty, or hiding something, or something. They're not being fully transparent with me. And at that point, usually they recommend you leave the room and come back in, so you can kind of have a clean break. And it's like, now the tone is switched. Now it's, I think you're guilty. Where I didn't say that at all. It's just a conversation. So it's a real switch.
Right. So the second phase of this interviewing style, and I appreciate there's textbooks, and I checked they're still offering virtual courses, and they're days long. So not to oversimplify, but the second part of this interviewing style, you're starting with this presumption of guilt, or at least a strong belief that this person is likely guilty or deceptive. What concerns do you have with starting an interview like that?
Well, my primary concern for me, and I think other people have examined this would have the same, is my primary concern is that what's happening in the first step of the process likely is flawed. And so the idea of reading nonverbal behavior, supposed responses to questions, the research on that is at best very weak, and at worst probably contradicts that idea. Certainly most of the nonverbal stuff, for example, has been, research I suggest is probably a coin flip, which means if you have people who think they can do something, assess guilt based on nonverbal behaviors, it's almost more dangerous if they think they can do it, because that means there's a certain higher level of confidence going into the room. So if you approach an interview, now, if you have made that decision perfectly every time, maybe, you can make arguments about the ethicalness of persuasion and so on, but you're not going to have any false confessions because everyone is guilty. The problem is in that first step is, and has been shown obviously to be flawed. So that means there's a likelihood that you're starting that presumption interview with a presumption of guilt, but the presumption isn't correct. And what happens and research has shown this, when people have a preconceived notion, it changes how they perceive things. It changes their questioning approach. It changes because you've already assumed guilt. Well, everything's interpreted through that lens. And so everything's geared towards, confession. If stuff comes up that doesn't match that, you just ignore it because you're so focused on. So that to me is the biggest criticism of Reed. Is not even the interrogation itself, although that has its problem. It's the pre-step assumption that very often, or certainly has a potential not to be true. There's other issues too that have been raised about it. About one, obviously the oppression. So if you're putting your hand up and saying, "No, we'll pass that. I don't want to hear that. I want to hear that. I know you did. I'm just trying to figure out why." Obviously, that can be interpreted as being oppressive and not allowing the person to speak and so on. So you have legal type issues. And then the persuasion part in terms of, blaming the victim, theme development, those sorts of things, both, there's an ethical argument, which is a more complex one, but then there's issues surrounding, again, the false confession side of things. And all of these things interact, so they're not independent. So you have someone who's already vulnerable, for example, they're young, intoxicated, they come in, the interviewer assumes guilt, they don't let them speak, they try to suggest to them that, maybe the victim had it coming and you were just, doing what anyone else in your situation would have done. Although, and then it's hour 2 and hour 3, all those things compound to have a potential for someone to, say something they didn't, just escape the room or whatever. And on the other side of things, even if you do get a admission, but you go over the top with the oppression, or the judge assumes that, you may get a true admission, which is no longer usable. So both those outcomes obviously are not desirable. So there's a combination of what happens within the approach, but to me, that by far the biggest issue is that presumption of guilt that drives the whole everything else and influences all the other aspects of the approach throughout the whole process.
So, Joe, would you say that is almost akin to a form of tunnel vision?
Yeah, absolutely. It is tunnel vision. It's a good definition of it. Is that everything that once you've made that switch, everything that you then see in the interrogation process is interpreted through this person did it. So if they offer up some sort of potential alibi or some sort of potential reason, that's ignored, or it's interpreted as whatever in a way that fits your theory. And that's been shown obviously in real world anecdotally, but even in research settings, of once that mind has been made up, it's really hard to change it. And so everything is, if they're denying it, well, they're just denying it because they don't want to admit to something bad. If they're everything can be interpreted as they're actually guilty, just want to talk about it. So it's very problematic for that reason. And obviously, again, there's issues with the persuasion tactics, but I think some of those are more problematic because of the tunnel vision that the officer's displaying versus the actual strategies themselves.
Right. So I just want to linger on the nonverbal or behavioral assessment that's happening in the first part of the interview. The research I've looked at, and I've talked to in other interviews, talked to people about how unreliable nonverbal cues are. And the consensus certainly seems that people do lots of strange things and will be nervous for lots of different reasons. So putting a lot of stock in those nervous or quote unquote shady behaviors is not a great way to move forward. And as you said, even police officers can fall victim to this and believe the eyes looking down or someone crossing their hands or being a little bit jittery or signs of trying to hide something or being deceptive. But that's not always the case. And the research seems to indicate that police officers and most of the public, it's really kind of a flip of a coin when you're looking at these behaviors. And you've written about that. I do want to add the caveat too that, as we talked about, police officers, they may not even be aware of that research, and this is things that they just may be trained in through their departments. And again, I'm not disparaging any one particular police force or police officers. Most of them are well-intentioned, good people that are trying to do their job and following the training that they've been offered. But do you see any utility at all in the read technique?
So I've been thinking about this, and me and my graduate student have starting to actually tackle that question, in the sense that, I think the approach itself is, it's probably outdated. There's stuff we know that we just shouldn't be doing that are in that. Again, for me, primarily in the opening stages versus the actual. But I do think, and this might be a little more controversial, but I think there's probably aspects of persuasion that are in there that may be able to be salvaged. That's the right word. In terms of, if combined with an information gathering approach, may have some utility. I think one of the issues, and there's an argument I make in a paper that actually hasn't been published yet, but we'll see what the response is. But I think a lot of the issues has been, these tactics have been always paired with guilt presumption. So the only goal of using them is not to gather information, not to gain dialogue, but get the person to say, I did it, period. But one of the issues with Reed is that's not that it is ineffective, it's quite effective. That's why we get the false confession. So is there a way to capture some of the persuasion elements of it in an effective way? I would say we don't know, because no one, as far as I'm aware, has attempted to do that. But I think it's been around for a while for a reason. And so what I would prefer to do, and one of the issues that I see, is that there's this dichotomy of, like, Reed becomes synonymous with everything that's bad with interviewing, and peace or whatever becomes synonymous with everything that's good about interviewing. Far too simplistic. And that's one of my issues with that approach, is that the read is very complex technique with a lot of moving parts. And so maybe there's some stuff in there that could be useful if used appropriately. Plus, a lot of the issues we've seen with, for example, false confessions, aren't because Reed told me to. It's become this catch-all for just bad interviewing. So someone interviews someone for 20 hours without a bathroom break and it gets blamed on Reed and accusatory styles. Well, Reed has its issues, but certainly doesn't recommend that. So the answer, I think, is I think the best approach, in my opinion, is take a outsider, objective look at it and ignore all the simplistic, and say, hey, as a scientist and a psychologist, is there stuff in here that, if done appropriately, could be an effective persuasion technique that avoids the issues of, say, false confession? And I think personally that perhaps, and I would like to explore that.
So that's something you're still exploring.
Yeah, I hope to explore that in the upcoming. My PhD student is just starting. He's hoping to explore that actually as part of his thesis. So more to come.
So the training you're offering right now, though, Joe, does it incorporate any read styles?
I would say no, certainly not on purpose. So there's no deception detection at all. That's just, in my opinion, far too risky and unnecessary. It's far more, again, peace-based, open-minded would be how I would describe it, and more rapport-based. There's some rapport in read as well, but yeah, that's. I can talk more about that if you want, but I think that's in terms of the training. The fundamental thing that I try to start with is the goal is not to get a confession. The goal is not to convict someone. The goal is not to high five the, hey, we got this person. The goal is information, period. And even if the person is lying, perfect. That's information. That's stuff you can investigate, right? That's stuff that the lawyers can hash out, the judges can hash out, you can investigate. So as long as a person is talking, you're being successful. And so the whole goal, the entire approach, and I think this is, in my opinion, a much better approach, is everything is geared towards getting the person to speak. Doesn't really matter what they say, at the beginning at least. You want them to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And as long as they're willing to talk, let them talk. And that's the biggest, as again, opposed to shutting people down. We only want to hear what we want to hear. It's more of a, I wasn't there, 3 sides at least every story. This is your opportunity to provide that. So hopefully you will. And getting out of that mindset of, we're here to catch this person, as opposed to, we're here just to gather information and deliver that information to the legal system to decide what to do with it.
And certainly there has been criticism of the read style of investigative interviews in Canada from our courts. I know a lot of police forces are moving away from read, or at least tinkering with it to change things or calling it a different name. To your knowledge, is the read style still being used in Canada?
Definitely is. I know there's organizations that, again, either, I would say primarily, and I would echo what you said earlier about it isn't because it's malicious or it's because they're just not aware often of different approaches. The information hasn't been spread to those organizations. So I am aware of some that are still using it. And again, that's just because that's what the training has been received and passed down through different officers. So yes, it still exists. Again, it's usually a piecemeal of experience, some stuff they got from a book, a seminar a couple years ago. So it's not typically a strict read following, but certainly it's still around, different components of it. It's being phased. I would argue it's being phased out. I mean, read itself even now has it frustrates me for various reasons, but a peace read training session where they kind of combine the two approaches. So I think even to them, there's a recognition that, hey, this accusatorial guilt presumptive approach is might be moving, to the being retired or being extinct. So, but it's still around. And I think the biggest, again, this goes back to the piecemeal thing. It's just getting people aware of the approach, demonstrating the utility of the approach, showing how it can be useful, both not just me, the academic, but practitioners who are using this new approach. If we could just accomplish that, my expectation that it would largely be gone, because I don't think, again, there's elements we might be able to take from it, but the approach itself of, hand in the face, I know you did this, I don't think that's necessary, and I don't think it would be retained if people were aware of newer approaches that are more effective.
So the hand in the face, just to clarify though, that once they make that transition to this person is guilty, they don't want to hear any explanations of their innocence or their continued explanations of innocence. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's almost, and it can be literally a hand in the face. So you walk in, typically you stand over the suspect and say, listen, John, just want to let you know, I've reviewed everything. I've, talked to you for a while, and there's no doubt in my mind that you took this money or that you murdered this person or whatever. And if then you're gauging their response. And if their response begins to be a denial, you shut it down. No, I didn't. No, I don't want to. Listen, I told you we're past that. We're past that. So it's that the idea is that if you allow the person to deny it, it gives them strength to stick to that denial, and you should be not allowing that to happen. Shut it down, shut it down. Let them know that you're not going to be convinced by anything aside from you did it. So it's, and again, there's an argument that that's effective in getting a person to tell you what you want them to say, but not effective, obviously, in free, open dialogue that's not guided by your assumption of what happened.
Okay, well, let's turn now to the PEACE model, which is again PEACE, and this is a style that is about gathering information, letting people talk, letting that free dialogue happen. Can you just take us through why you believe this is more in line with the psychological research?
Yeah, so it originated in the UK, really based on a couple of really high-profile false confessions that happened there, and their various judicial rulings that you can't do that anymore. And so academics, practitioners got together and created this new, not new anymore, but new at the time approach. And PEACE just stands for the different stages of the interview, so planning, engage and explain, account, closure, and evaluation. And I would say the major difference is the one is no presumption of guilt. That's really huge in my opinion. No attempt to assess deception. There's no at the beginning because of the biasing effects and because it changes how treat the person. Very rapport based, so it's just trying to make them feel comfortable, build rapport. Do you need make sure they understand their rights and go through it multiple times, and can I get anything for you? Bottle of water, need to use a bathroom. So it's all about and treating the person respectfully and wanting to hear their side of the story. And the other major part of it is that switch from I don't want to hear that, I want to hear that, I just want to know why I know you did it, to tell me what happened. And sometimes the person says no because I'm exercising my right to remain silent. Okay, fine. But there's different ways you can overcome that in terms of, or at least work with that and say that's fair enough, that's your right. No, I'm respecting that fully. But there is some things I'd like to put to you or discuss with you because we're doing this investigation. We're here for a reason. So it's a very respectful, open, opportunity for that person. And the goal of it, and when it's successful, is that the person does speak. And if they get a confession, great. If they don't, hopefully a whole bunch of admissions that can be investigated, that can be compared to other accounts to see if it corroborates, can lead to further inquiries and so on. So the goal, again, explicitly isn't go in there and get a confession or don't come out. It's go in, get as much information as you possibly can, and then we'll reassess and go from there. So that's probably the two major differences. And again, there's none of the blaming the victim or even strategically in the original piece anyway. None of those what they call minimization type approaches. It's more rapport, open-ended dialogue, and then assessing it.
And is there the same type of persuasive techniques or questionings or similar that you would use in PEACE?
Not the same as Read. So obviously, with Read, one of the biggest tools is the minimization side. So you spin a story, but hey, listen, you were down your luck. The company doesn't care about you anyway. Anyone else in your situation, it's a couple $1,000. I mean, you took it. It's not the end of the world. So you're basically minimizing, blaming the company, et cetera, et cetera. Though that type of approach is not included in the PEACE approach. It's much more of a just opportunity to tell me what happened. If there is some evidence to present to them, you can do that systematically to get them to speak to it if they're willing to, but there's no overt attempt to, convince them to own up to something. There is, and this is part of that paper that I wrote that hasn't come out yet, but the idea of rapport and building that connection, which can be perceived, I would argue, as a more subtle persuasion technique, where if you do stuff for, you treat them nice with respect and openness, and I can get you a bottle of water, something to eat, no problem, and we're just chatting about this and that and building that connection. The goal of that is so that the person will relax and open up. So is that a persuasion technique? I would argue yes. That's why you're doing it. You don't actually perhaps respect that person or really enjoy their company, but you do those things strategically to build that connection so they're more likely to answer your question. So it's not the minimization type approach of Read. It's more of a build a connection with the person. Hopefully they feel comfortable. The more comfortable they are, the more likely they'll answer your question.
And there's no real, as you said, there's no overt or direct confrontation with the person you're interviewing.
That's right. Yeah. Even, and they have a challenge phase in which you would say something like, "Hey, listen, I appreciate you coming here. You mentioned that you were at home all evening. Now I do have cell phone records that, and you said your cell phone was with you all night. That suggests that was pinging off a tower two hours away. I'm just trying to understand how those two things could be So you're still challenging them softly, but it's not a, hey, you're lying to me, I know you're lying to me, because it's more of a still information open-ended, like, hey, listen, you're saying this, I got this, I'm just trying to reconcile these two things. So it's always tries to maintain that non-accusatorial, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of this approach, as opposed to, again, you did this.
Okay. So the planning and preparation that goes into an interview like this, can you just give us a bit of an idea of, because that to me is a very important phase, that you have
Mm-hmm.
all your planning and prep, which could be, okay, this is what we are going to present to him if he says this, or even just your questions, the flow of your questions. Can you just give us an idea of why that is such an important process in preparing for an interview?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly again, if you're doing a suspect interview, a big, the bigger ones. I mean, that could be days of planning and prep. So obviously, you include things like reviewing the evidence. You'd want to make sure you know exactly what other people have, whether it's witnesses or what the physical evidence is. You want to know exactly everything that's happened so far, and the reason you want to do that, one, to prepare your evidence so you can present it to them if you need to, but also while they're talking, and even if it's a back and forth conversation all over the place, you're trying to obviously identify things that they're saying that doesn't match that evidence. Oh yeah, I was home all night. Okay, bing, based on your review of the evidence, talk to other witnesses that you know they weren't, or you think they weren't because of their car was seen or their cell phone hit or whatever. So knowing that information is key, because you can't make those connections in the room in the moment unless the evidence very well. Also, you want to learn what you can about the person, and again, that goes back to the rapport stuff. So is there something you can connect over? Is there something that you can relate to or think they're going to ask about that you can answer, just so you can build that sense of rapport, connection, trust, and so on with that person? Because that is one of the fundamental aspects of the approach, is that the person's decision whether to talk to you is largely based on the relationship you have with them. So knowing ways you might be able to facilitate this part of the planning as well. Those are probably the two biggest thing. And then again, having organized in terms of what do you know, what do you want to know, what evidence do you have that supports what you think you know. If you're going to present evidence, I know a colleague that I work with at Durham will put together often PowerPoint presentations with evidence embedded in it, and they can use that if needed to say, hey, listen, you mentioned this, but as you can see from, or it could be paper, but 2021, so you can use electronic clips of things. And that's all, again, that idea of when you're in there, you want dialogue. And so if that's a soft challenge or a presentation of evidence, it's not accusatory, but it hopefully gets the person speaking. And that's all you want to do. So you have different tools you can hopefully create that dialogue.
And Joe, one of the I'm not an advocate of this position, but one of the critiques that I did read about Peace is that some may say that it's too soft of an approach in terms of interviewing a suspect, especially if you're very convinced that the suspect is guilty. Let's say you have a very key piece of evidence that you are convinced that this person committed whatever crime, murder, we'll say. You have them at the scene. You have CCTV footage, for example, of them at the scene. Why would you waste time with trying to build rapport and not confronting them overtly? How would you respond to a criticism like that?
Yeah, I think it's a complex one. I agree, Peace is soft, but I think the criticism is a misunderstanding of what is effective when talking to people. And so, yes, it's not yelling, yes, it's not accusatorial, and so on, but those, and this goes to intelligence interviewing too. There's been a ton of research in that area on rapport, and again, you have this ticking clock scenario where you have to get information from someone. It still goes back to the likelihood that someone's going to, now if you already have that much evidence and you don't need them to tell you, then part of it's why bother doing an interview at all. So what's your goal, right? What are you trying to accomplish? If you're trying to get accomplished, this is what I hope it would be. You still want maybe it's their motive, maybe it's their state of mind. These are all things that can be useful, obviously, in the legal process. It's always going to be more effective to sit down with a person, treat them respectfully, give them a chance to, get their side of the story, their perspective first, as opposed to putting your perspective on it. And then you still have that evidence that you can present and show to them and say, hey, listen, this is your opportunity to explain this if you want to. You don't have to. And that will, the early research even from the UK, the confession rates actually didn't change after they switched. So it's likely you're not going to change much in terms of the confession. But the whole point of this approach is that's not what you're going after. You're going after as much information, explanation as you possibly can to get that person, again, state of mind, their planning behind it, their explanation for the different evidence you have. If you can get that, then you have all that information that help the investigation, help the eventual judicial process. So I think there's a misunderstanding you have, because they're quote unquote bad people, you have to kind of go after them somehow. But the same human-based social strategies that are effective in getting people to talk to you also work with these type of individuals. And there's some high-profile examples that have been released. You think of the Russell Williams example, even the Alec Manassian one that was just released, or that was just found guilty on with Rob Thomas from Toronto. Very open, very, how's your day going, walking through it. These type of connection-based approaches are the ones that make people talk. And that's ultimately what you want. So if you want someone to just tell you what you want to hear, absolutely. I mean, that's why they invented torture in the Middle Ages and so on, was to get a confession. But they already knew what they, it was just a matter of getting them to repeat what you wanted them to. If you actually want to know what they're thinking and what they did and so on, this is the type of approach that will do that. Doesn't mean you don't use your evidence. Doesn't mean you accept I didn't do it at face value. What it does mean is you keep an open mind and just try to get them to say as much as possible. And again, because it's been used in these examples, and there's one that's here in Durham that's being accused, basically serial killer, I guess. The ruling is in a couple of days, and my colleague did the interview using this approach. He's the guy I train with. And again, those are the type of examples that are most effective, because, hey, it's not just in theory this might be useful. It's been used and it's been effective when you just treat people respectfully, openly, get a conversation. It takes a bit longer, but you're going to get more clean information from them, as opposed to just force them down a road that you already thought of. So is it soft? Sort of. But it's also more subtly effective, I think, than a more accusatory in-your-face approach.
The Russell Williams example, I believe that's on YouTube if people wanted to watch that interview. So that would be an example of the open dialogue peace approach.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's following a step-by-step piece or some mixed stuff in there, but the main takeaway, and there was some issues there potentially with how it went to court, I think, about suggesting tearing your wife's house apart and so on. But the main takeaway, and the Alec Manassian's one's full, is on YouTube as well, if people have 3 hours to spend watching that. But I think the takeaway from that one, the Russell Williams in particular, is very open. Hey, I can get you a coffee? Do you want a coffee? You're here of your own free will. Perfect. Just back and forth. And then the use of evidence of the tire marks and footprints and so on. I'm not sure how much that was stretched. I don't know. But again, there was no, hey, we know you did it. Tell me what I want to hear. It's conversation, it's dialogue, evidence presentation, and those, even if it wasn't a strict peace approach, that type of idea, in my experience and opinion, and talking to practitioners too, will in the long term get you a lot more information.
Right. So this idea that we have to be tough with suspects can sometimes be tied to the notion that we owe it to a victim of a violent crime in particular. Why are we trying to be buddy or friends with them? But you don't buy that argument for the same reasons, that you're trying to solve a crime, and gathering information is what you need to do to achieve that.
Yeah, and I would actually again argue that that's a misunderstanding of psychology, of how people work. So if you actually want to do the victim service, then you do treat the person with respect. You do be open with them and stuff, not because you want to have a beer afterwards, but it's because that's what's going to get the most information and ultimately resolve the investigation, which is your goal, right? So it's a strategy, it's an approach, and this is one of the big benefits is, and this is my colleague Paul often talks about, when you're then in court, you feel a lot better about the process if you've walked them through their rights, if you've met all their needs, if you treated them with respect the whole way through, because the likelihood of being any challenges are very, very low as well. So not only have you done a good interview, the final process for the court procedure is clean. And so again, to me, it's even the room setup, this idea of like metal chairs, and that looks, if you're trying to punish the person, sure, but if you actually want them to talk to you and to resolve the investigation, why are you using this tiny little jail celly room? Use a room they feel comfortable. If they're comfortable, they're going to talk to you. I mean, to me, it's just, I get the mindset, because you want to go after this person. But if you truly want to get to the truth and resolve for the victim's sake, these are strategies you should be using, because they're effective. On the surface, they might not intuitively make sense, but there's a reason why they work. And again, there's so many benefits to them that I think once people see it in action and understand all the different sides of it, we've never had anyone say like, nah, I don't get it at all. It's, it makes sense, I think.
Okay, so we'll shift gears just a little bit and talk about the Rcmp has modified the piece approach from what I understand, and they are incorporating what has been, well, a hybridized version of piece, essentially consisting of two phases. There's the non-accusatory interview, and then at some point it will shift to an accusatory interview where these non-accusatory methods have been exhausted and they switch to a more direct approach. And my understanding is that the interviewers are taught of the unreliability of nonverbal cues. But in general, Joe, do you have any concerns with this hybridized model?
Potentially. My colleagues have put out a paper on that, the risk of some of the end points of that accusatory. To me, it is a potential risk. And what I mean by that is if the interviewer is properly trained, if they fully follow what's in the guidebook of the phased interview guidebook, which is pretty extensive, the chance of a poor outcome is pretty slim, in my opinion. Is there a risk of, if you retain some of those accusation and persuasion tactics and retain them in the model, is there a risk for someone to push them a bit too far, perhaps rely on something they shouldn't? I think yes. So that would be my concern. I think it's a step. I personally think it's a very large step forward based on what has been done, absolutely, and I think most people would agree with that, even those that are very against any type of overt persuasion. It's a huge step forward. It is legally acceptable, everything that's in there, and I think if used the way it's laid out, because there is warnings against vulnerabilities, there's warnings against nonverbal behaviors for deception and so on, then it shouldn't be used inappropriately. But again, there's always that risk that it'll be taken further than what's been intended. But there's always going to be a tension there, I think, between trying to accomplish a goal of people who don't want to talk to you, making that or convincing them to talk to you, and where does that line go too far in terms of potential for both inadmissibility but also false confessions and so on. And I think that is the tension, and will never probably fully be resolved. When is it too far? When is it, pushing a little too far on that side, or not far enough? So it's a difficult one to deal with. My takeaway on it would be this is a great step away from what's been done, and we can argue about the particulars, but I'd rather this than what has been done previously for sure. So
All right. So we'll turn now, Joe, to a general question that, as we talked about off air a little bit, I was initially reluctant to ask because I don't like to reduce a very complex issue or topic of study down to simplistic terms. But my hope is that law enforcement personnel or maybe police officers will listen to this interview. So I am going to ask it, and you've been kind enough to indicate that you're prepared to answer it at least somewhat. But generally, could you give me maybe your top 2 or 3 things that you think interviewers should avoid doing a suspect interview?
yeah, so I think the biggest, in terms of suspect, there's two things, I guess. The biggest thing I would say is that interruptions or not allowing the person to fully articulate whatever it is they want to articulate. So giving the person the space and the will and to just tell their account. Now again, some people won't speak at all, and that's an issue that can be overcome. But one of the biggest issues that you see, victim witness but also suspect, is again not allowing the person to just tell their story from their perspective. And again, you might know as an officer that doesn't match up, there's a temptation to jump in but if they're talking, you're gaining information. So that's one thing. And I think the other major issue with suspect interviewing goes back to the mindset of this isn't about pushing, confession, and that's a win. Switching the mindset to a successful interview is one where you got as much information from the person as they would conceivably be willing to give. And I think that, to me, it makes a huge difference because it changes what your perspective is, changes what you're going after in your approach. Because again, instead of both tunnel vision, feeling the pressure to get a confession, pushing the interview perhaps farther than it should be for those reasons, instead it's just, I want to gain as much information as possible and taking the pressure off that confession or bust. And that, I think, it also takes a lot, like suspect interviews from talking to officers are often, those are the ones that they get real nervous about and really find very difficult for good reason. But if you change the perspective from, hey, you're just two people and you're just trying to, this person will talk to you and you can use your tactics and so on. But instead of I need a confession. Instead, switching from I just want to build a connection with this person, see what they're willing to offer, present a bit of evidence, see what they have to say about it. That's a much different perspective on what your goal is. So I think the avoiding the whole guilt presumptive, they definitely did it, I'm going after that. If you can avoid that, that'll change all of the other stuff you use and how you use it. So those probably the two, most important things. And then the smaller thing, which I don't see that often, is again avoiding the big things of, hey, we have your DNA when you don't, or hey, if you just tell me what I want to hear, I'll grant you bail, or offering the basics of inadmissibility. But in terms of the actual poor interviewing, it's let the person talk and accept what they have to say until at least the very end.
Well, thank you for that. I want to shift. I'm becoming mindful of your time now. So I want to shift gears and just discuss a component very closely linked to obviously investigative interviews here with the comprehension of legal rights. And these are required to be given to a suspect or an accused at the beginning of an investigative interview. And this is something you've written about and studied, and just the comprehension of these rights. And now, to ensure that our listeners are aware of what we exactly are discussing, what legal rights are you referring to in this context?
Yeah, so the two primary ones, if someone's being detained in some way, whether it's under arrest or just detained generally, would be the right to silence and the right to legal counsel. And those are, won't get too much into it, but those are derived from the Charter, Section 7 and Section 10A and 10B. And then case law, different rulings in the Supreme Court and so on have kind of framed what those look like, and police obligations and so on. So it's really the right to not incriminate yourself, to choose not to speak, and not any inference drawn from that if you choose not to. And then the second part obviously is the access to contact legal counsel and get that legal advice from a lawyer before you're actually questioned about the event. Are the two big ones.
What does the research suggest in terms of the comprehension of these legal rights?
So it's pretty clear that it's not well understood for a couple of reasons. One would be the way that they're written is written essentially to meet legal requirements as opposed to actually giving information in an understandable way. So it's legalese, not obliged, blah, blah, blah. The second issue, too, is that people, and this is some more recent research in Canada and the US too, but people come in Canada in particular, come in with assumptions about their legal right, usually derived from an American context, whether that's crime shows or so on, that they think they have that differ from what they actually have. And the two big examples are, one, the right to silence, where many people think if I say I'm exercising my right to remain silent, the interview stops. But in Canada, that's not the case, Singh being the major case law there, where you have the right to remain silent, but the police also have the right to continue to question you as long as it's done properly. So people often don't fully realize that hey, just because I want to exercise my right to silence doesn't mean the interview is over. The other big one is the presence of a lawyer, where again, this idea that I'm not speaking until I have my lawyer present, like you see in crime shows for the US, but that's not actually a right that's can technically be afforded, but it's not one that's police have to. It's just that you contact your lawyer, and only a single time. So unless something changes, you can't just say I want to talk to my lawyer again. You don't have that right again unless their circumstances changes, jeopardy's higher, or new charges or something. So there's both initial misconception of, because it's read quickly and it's legalese, and then there's assumptions that the person brings in that they think they have that they don't, and that aren't, that obviously you're not going to cover all the things that they might think they have that they don't in that delivery. So what we tend to find is people, they know the basics, like I can remain silent, I can call a lawyer, but beyond that, there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about how to use it and what those things mean. So that's what we found anyway.
And there's a duty obviously on the police to provide these rights, but there's no duty to verify. Is that correct?
Yeah, technically in most cases, again, unless there's an obvious issue that the person doesn't speak English as a first language or something that's obvious. Otherwise, it's just a delivery of them and the opportunity to exercise them. So they have to, do you actually want to call a lawyer? Yes or no? But there's no obligation to break it down and work through it and so on in most cases.
And I should clarify too. Most of the time, when you're reading someone their charter rights or giving them their charter rights, you are trained and encouraged to get some sort of a response, and you will ask, do you understand? And you have to document, especially the charter rights times when you've read them, and document their response, etc. But reading from, because most police officers will be given a charter card, for example, and it has all the legal rights that they are required to read to someone that they have arrested or detained. reading verbatim from the charter card, Joe, do you think that is part of the problem? You mentioned that the way they're written can be confusing just because of the legalese aspect of it. So do you think the rights maybe should be reformulated in a more straightforward fashion?
Yeah, that's something we've argued is that I think there's two ways you could do it. One is to rewrite the card. We did publish a paper years ago on that in terms of simplifying the language and explaining it in different terms so it's more understandable for people. That does seem to be effective. What I think the best strategy, because this actually verifies, is to, and this is something we cover in our training that we do, is deliver it, maybe explain it, but then, hey, Trevor, what does that mean in your own words? Because that way you can, no matter how you read it or didn't read it, you can verify that they can, oh, that means I can call my lawyer if I want. I don't have to speak to you. Perfect. We're both on the same page. So that is probably the biggest recommendation because, again, even if you simplify the language, maybe they're not paying attention, maybe their mind's spinning, which it likely is, about other things. So that way you can just verify that, hey, they fully understand what it is we're delivering. And this is something, again, I think goes back to this idea of peace being too soft and we need to get after people. There's been this assumption, well, you don't want people to know their rights too much because then they'll exercise them and it'll throw the interview off. But I actually argue it's the opposite, where if you take the time to say, hey, listen, I want to make sure you're fully informed, go through the rights. Did you want to call a lawyer? Did you? Okay, perfect. I want you to fully understand you don't have to speak to me. Even the secondary caution about if you've talked to anyone else, you don't have to repeat that. I want to make sure we're on the same page. And because instead of trying to race through it and pretend in court it's going to look great, there's going to be no concerns about admissibility, but also again it's the opportunity to create that connection with the person. I respect you enough that I'm going to give you your full understanding, fully understand what you are available to you and isn't. I'm not trying to hide anything. Here's what your rights. You don't have to speak to me. I hope you do, but if you don't, that's fully your choice. That actually is I would argue, a subtle persuasion technique where you're building a connection with that person because you're treated with respect and openness. And long term, that will actually pay dividends in most cases, as opposed to trying to race through it and cover off that as quickly as possible. Flip it around and make it actually part of the interview where you're taking the time to do it properly because you want them to be fully informed. So in a long term manner, it's I would argue it's more effective in convincing the person to talk to you.
Okay. And the manner in which it's read, Joe, you've already indicated that's the speed in which it's read matters. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so and I think I don't know if this is intentional. I would suspect it's more of a habit where because it's a card, because it's memorized by officers who use so much, you just sort of be either at retain instruct counsel without delay, and so on. The wording differs. That's another issue where it differs quite a bit, but because it's so rote, it's just so quickly. And again, you've got a combination where it's legal language, the grammar is usually really confusing. Combine that with a really fast speed and a person who's probably thinking about 15 other things at the time, all those combine where there's just no way that the person's going to fully be in tune. So slowing it down, simplifying the language, getting it read back to you. Because the other thing we found consistently, us and other researchers, is no matter how fast you read it, no matter how legalese is it, if you then ask them, do you understand? Well over 90% of the time they say yes. Why? Probably social pressure. You're just supposed to say yes. I don't want to, bug this person or feel like I don't understand it or look stupid or whatever. So just ask them, do you understand it? They will almost always say yes. And then you say, well, can you explain it to your own words? And clearly they don't because they're not able to articulate all the aspects of it. So simply asking, do you understand? It's, that's enough for legal perspectives, absolutely. But for actual comprehension, it's not enough. So slowing it down, simplifying, and then simply saying, hey, listen, that's a lot to take in. Could you just let me know your understanding in your own words about, what that means? Clarify anything, and then you move on. And again, that both shows respect to the person, but also there's very little risk that the defense lawyer is going to say, hey, my client did this, my didn't that. So it covers all the boxes, I think, in terms of a good approach.
Right. I think that's a great approach. And as you said earlier, when you're doing a suspect interview, police officers are nervous too, right? And I think there is a bit of a misconception that if you move away from the charter card at all, you're opening yourself up to a lengthy cross-examination or getting attacked in court. I guess because the criticism might be that if someone erroneously states their legal rights, then a police officer has to get into kind of giving a mini legal seminar or lesson about what those rights are. Would you have any concerns about an officer going down that avenue?
Yes, I think the couple keys. One is that you have to make sure you fully understand all the ins and outs of the rights as well. Now, I understand most officers would, but even in our training, some of these things about a second call, I want to go back to my cell now. Like some of these ins and outs, obviously you have to be fully informed about those. And is that a risk? Yes. We've we've seen it happen. Some of the clips we've shown where the person, like, anyway, I won't use the example, but said something that just wasn't correct. But that to me is an opportunity to then say, well, yeah, I appreciate you saying that, but really what it means is, you don't have to speak to me today, or clarifying that, yes, that's a bit of back and forth, but again, that's the only way you can be fully sure that A, the person actually understands, and B, can show to the judicial process that, hey, we went through this, we went back and forth, we made sure he was fully informed about this and had an opportunity to understand it before we move forward. Is it a risk? Yes. But to me, it's less of a risk than getting to court and, hey, you didn't cover this off enough. My client's got like a grade 2 education. You should have known that. Why didn't you clarify that? So yeah, so there's a risk either way, but I would rather err on the side of doing my best to fully inform this person versus ignoring it or not exploring it. And then, because again, we say this all the time, one of the worst thing that could happen is you do a great interview, you get to court a year and a half later, and the whole thing gets thrown out. Like, how does that make you feel, the victim feel? So why would you risk that? Take the time to do that stuff up front, and then you're gold for the rest of the process.
Well, Joe, this has been a really great chat today, and I am mindful now that it's lunchtime where you're at, so I don't want to keep you too much longer here. You've been really generous with your time, and we really appreciate it. I'd love to get your thoughts on other topics and issues like Mr. Big, but we won't get into that today. Yeah, so maybe down the road we will have another chance to talk. But again, we really appreciate your time. Do you want to tell people where they can follow you on social media, or give any endorsements to your lab project?
Sure. Yeah. So on Twitter, at Prof Eastwood is my Twitter on there. I post a lot about research, but also the training, Eastwood Consulting training that I do with my police colleagues, because my goal is to improve interviewing practices, both through research, through training, and that's my passion, I guess, from all avenues. So I think there's a lot of people out there, and I'll just say, I don't know if you can edit this out, but I think I want to say that I have a ton of respect for officers, investigators that do this work, because it's very hard, very complex. And my goal has always just been to try to get as much good information into their hands as possible. And there's nothing worse to me than seeing people use practices, not because just because they don't know that there's a better way of doing things, and that's frustrating. So that's my underlying goal to my career, as it were, is that getting the information into the hands of people who can use it. And I just have a ton of respect for people who go into the room and deal with these people, and I want to let them have as strong an evidence base for doing that as possible. And so I do that through training and research and all those different avenues.
Well, that's great. That's great, because obviously I'm biased, but I too share the admiration for all law enforcement personnel. And again, it's a skill, and it's something that you have to work at. And most of these people are really well-intentioned people that want to serve their community. So having people like yourself and the groups that you are involved in give that information to law enforcement professionals, I think is fantastic. Joe, where can people go to learn more about the Applied Law Enforcement Research and Training Lab?
Yeah, so I have my lab website, which I have to update, but alertlab.ca is my research side of things. So I have my grad students and my projects, and then I have my eastwoodconsulting.net is my training side of what I do. So I have the alertlab.ca is my research side, and then Eastwood Consulting is my training side, where law enforcement and private agencies and stuff where I do my training. So those are my two contact points, as well as obviously Twitter is my primary social media that I use, Prof Eastwood.
Okay, great. That's excellent. We'll put the links in the show notes, and your Twitter handle. Again, Joe,
Yep.
can't thank you enough, and we'll talk to
You're
you
very
soon.
welcome. Thank you very much.